sono alzato. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Una mattina mi sono alzato e io ho trovato l'invasor. Oh partigiano, portami via. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morire. Oh partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morire.
So what is it that we're actually responding to? Well, on the left is the image you should be able to almost draw in your sleep by now. That's Fletcher's tree, right? The tree of architecture, the tree of architectural culture. It's kind of drawn at the height of Western imperialism and colonization, and it's a real statement about the world. And it's all about what is superior, what has priority, what has importance, and on the other side of the coin, what is inferior to it. All of that is very implicit in this drawing. This is sort of a general idea of the architectural canon, and this is the Renaissance canon. When you see it, it should ring a bell. I hope it rings a bell, right? Because the story on the Renaissance canon is that there were some ancient civilizations that achieved some things in Europe, and then the world went quiet, and then there were some Europeans that achieved other things, and modern day civilization, this is where we all are. And us as part of this modern day civilization, these are the contributions that we have to thank for us being who we are and where we are, right? And so this is a thoroughly Eurocentric story, and that is also a thoroughly Eurocentric story, right? So the architectural canon is a mirror image of the Renaissance canon. They both tell exactly the same story. The same little part of the world is celebrated, and the rest of the world is either invisible or included, but in a way that is really in the most derogatory kind of way, you know. So there is inclusion here. It's not as if other things are not mentioned. They are mentioned, but you know, what kind of diversity is that? What kind of inclusion is that? What kind of a shared history is that? You know, it's not as if there isn't diversity. It's not as if there isn't inclusion. There is, but what kind of inclusion is that, right? So inclusion is not the core of our story. It's not the core diagnosis of the problem. The problem is deeper than that. It's deeper than simply diversity. This stuff is about many other things, right? So what we're saying, what we're trying to identify is that it's not just about presenting different stories and different cultures around the world, or that is one part of it, but we actually have to look at what is this tree actually saying, what kind of principles is this tree actually, what forms this tree. And this is not a real tree. This is not real history. Hey, I hope you guys can pick that up by now. It's not real history. It's formed by all of these ideas that people have had that wrote this, but it's not a real history. Neither is that real history, right? But it is what we have. It is what the canon looks like. So this is what we're responding to, right? We are identifying canon and what the canon looks like generally and what it looks like in South Africa. And then we try to make the point that there's actually a lot of fascinating and interesting and complex and useful and beautiful and all kinds of things that other cultures have to say and other parts of the world have to say. But then at the same time, it's also to say that there are shared histories, there are conversations that happen. It's not this line of purity, you know, Western purity, racial purity, European purity, whatever, you know, that things actually look a little bit or a lot different to that in reality, right? So this is one way to draw history, and that is what our architectural canon has looked like. This is one way to tell a story, which is what the Renaissance story looks like. But these are the way that some other historians are starting to tell history, right? These are some other diagrams. So this is a story of various scientific achievements, various contributions to a general project of knowledge, you know, over thousands of years, from 3000 BC up to the present. And what you notice is our civilizations rise and fall. They have high points and low points, right? And you can select, you know, this is a very selective story. And that is a highly selective story, right? It's just picking out the little moments when European civilizations, or parts of what is now called Europe, had high points. And it's representing that as if it is the whole history of the world. And it, in a very serious way, subjugates everyone and everything else to a position of, you know, a subordinate position, an inferior position, right? This tells you in no uncertain terms what and who is superior in the world. This is a very different kind of story. All civilizations rise and fall. No one remains forever up here. It doesn't exist. It's not how the world works. Everyone goes up and down, right? And this is another way of telling that the story of science. It's from another historian, and looking at how different civilizations, where they intersect at other points, you know, it's very different to this kind of story. This is from another historian, you know, responding to that narrative. It should actually look something like this, with multiple contributions from different civilizations all over the world, right? So what we have is this is our, I mean, it's not an ancient story, you know. This is a story that is still being told to the present day and presented as true history. But there are multiple other ways to do it. We could do it like this, or we could do it like this, or we could do it like this, right? This is from Capra. Okay, he's a historian of science, in his book, The Turning Point. And what you see here is you can take a cross-section. If you take a cross-section through any period, you'll find a different civilization is at the top and a different one is at the bottom. It just depends where you take that cross-section, right? Sometimes if you choose very particular moments, yeah, there could be some civilization in Europe that is at the top. If you pick another one, then they're right at the bottom, you know. So this story is a complete mythology, right? I don't want you to think that, you know, it's true, but we just have to be nice about it. No, it's not even true. It's not nice and it's not true, right? Because if you take a cross-section through any one year, Egyptian civilization is going to be at the top, right? And Sumerians is coming up, you know. It's the Aegean, it's Syriac, Hellenistic, right? Where we took it through in the what is sort of known as the medieval period, you see the Islamic civilization is above anything else, and the West is coming out of the Dark Ages. Yeah. In our time, the West is, you know, the super duper powerful civilization in the world, right? But that has not been a consistent line through history. So if you stand here and you look back, don't project that point back, because it doesn't work like that. So this is the kind of discourse that we're responding to. It's an old one, but it's also a present one, right? It's coming on a long way, and it's still here with us to this very day. It hasn't gone anywhere, right? And these are some of the multiple other ways in which we can tell history, right? So this is what we're talking about here. It's not just about presenting different stories, different perspectives, and trying to be a little bit more inclusive, because that is not going to address the actual problem that we're dealing with. It's just going to add more, like these little branches, it's just going to add more and more little branches on. That's all it's really going to do if we remain there, right? To stay there is just to add more branches onto that tree without actually changing the core narrative. And what we're actually trying to do here is to say that there have been convergences and conversations that have actually made the world. It's not this tree of continental, ethnic, racial, cultural purity that this is trying to tell us. We're actually saying, no, there's actually conversations that has happened. There's actually things that rise and fall. There are actually things that intersect with one another and have shared histories, right? There are other civilizations that have made massive contributions to the world. So this is where we are now. We're talking about shared histories. We're sketching out a different story to that story. A story that looks more like this, and a story that looks more like this, and a story that looks more like this. Right? So we're responding to this, and we're sketching out something that looks more like this, right? And in our course, our cross-section is at this point. It's in the medieval, late medieval and early modern period. That's the sort of zone that we've taken our cross-section through. And we've started to look at how we call it Islamic, but it's really very pluralistic, how this civilization is really soaring above anyone else at this period. But I don't want you to think that is a line through history either. It's not. It's also something that has risen at a particular time, right? If we took it here, we'd have a very different section. If we took it there, we'd have a very different section. If we took it there, we have a very different section, right? So none of these lines go all the way through history, especially not that one, which is the story where we are expected to believe, okay? So this is not real history. It's a mythology, and it's a mythology that has been formed through all kinds of ideas and relations of power at particular times that story was created. So we're here now, all about conversations, shared histories, convergences, intersections, right? Because we're responding to this stuff. And then we're diving into detail, right? So all these scholars are doing this, all of them, in different ways, in their own particular field, right? So this was one scholar that we looked at last week, George Saliba, and we spoke about how he studied astronomy in detail in the late medieval and early modern period. His history is a history like this, and he's responding to that. Then, for very briefly, we looked at Hans Belting. So there's a whole mythology around Brunelleschi and perspective, that Brunelleschi invented perspective on his drawing board in a moment of inspiration. Hans Belting says this has been coming on for hundreds of years, this story of perspective. It crosses cultures, it crosses different scientists, and he shows that and he traces that for us. So Belting is doing a history like this, and he's responding to a history like this. He calls it, literally in his text, he calls it a mythology. So that's what we covered last week. And before last week, we even did the documentary, which is doing exactly the same thing. The documentary is this story, and it's responding to this story. Today, we're going to cover two more scholars, very, very briefly. We're first going to look at Deborah Howard. She's an architectural historian that since the 80s has been studying various aspects of the culture of Venice and the medieval Italian city-states. And then we're going to look at a scholar that has emerged on the scene with a bang very recently, Benedict Kohler, who's a German banker who has now become a kind of economic historian. And we're going to look at his book. And he looks at this same period that we are looking at, but from an economic perspective. And particularly, he's speaking about the birth of this thing called capitalism, which sounds like it has nothing to do with architecture, but you'll see it has everything to do with not just architecture, but even colonization and even the very shaping of the South African landscape. So this is where we're gonna go today, right? Venice and trade and economics. This is where we were last week. Science, astronomy, perspective, and that is where we were in the weeks before that. And all of this stuff is just looking at different scholars. All of them are trying to do this, and they are responding to this entrenched canon that is still our present. Okay, and these are the scholars that are doing that work for us, because it's hard work to do that, because you really have to dig in. You really have to go back to the primary sources, back to the text, back to the evidences, and sketch out something that is actually a more accurate reflection than these kinds of mythologies. Okay, you should see us back on Venice on our Google Maps. Off the northeast coast of Italy. Okay, or the north is kind of to your left. It's an island. It's actually like a little marshland in a lagoon, actually, right? And it was founded after the fall of Rome. There were a lot of people fleeing cities, and people fled from the mainland, and they set up this this little settlement on a marshy lagoon, which over some many centuries later eventually takes the shape of a city. And the core of the city, we're going to look a little bit about how this city came into being, and we're going to focus in on, this is the main iconic heart of Venice, San Marco, this district. And this is the core of that district, right? It's you have the main square, Piazza San Marco, and then you have the basilica, right? The main church in the city, and this tower that kind of sits on the corner of these two squares, right? That's like the core of the city. And this fantastic church with these that has a face onto the square, and it has these 5 domes that sit on top of it. So that's the first sort of moment that we look at, and then the main bridge is here in the Rialto area. And this bridge was the historic commercial core of Venice. So you cross over this bridge, and then there's a square here, and then this is kind of the historic market, this whole zone here, this line of trade, and then the square, and all of this is sort of part of the historic market district core. And then it goes over the bridge, and then it was extended to over the bridge as well. And this over here is a fondaco, which is where foreign merchants get housed, right? When they come from other countries and they come to trade in Venice, this is where foreign merchants will stay. And they have their lodgings and their places to lock up their goods and so on. So that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about this city and these two, specifically focusing on these 2 places, San Marco and the piazza in front of it, and the Rialto and the market and the lodgings, which is known as a fondaco, if my Italian pronunciation is correct. Okay, that was just an introduction. Okay, so now we've got this book in front of us, Venice and the East, Deborah Howard's book that I mentioned just now. She's an architectural historian, and she's looking at Venice and the East. The subtitle of the book is The Impact of the Islamic World on Venetian Architecture, 1100 to 1500, right? Which is another way of saying investigating a conversation, architectural history as a conversation between different cultures. That would be an alternative subheading. She's trying to construct a different history, and very rigorously with all kinds of evidence, especially visual evidence. Okay, so this is her book, one of her major works in 2000, which is published. We're going to read just the introduction and a little bit of this fourth chapter called The Merchant City. So let's quickly go through a little bit of her introduction. So here she introduces us to Venice. The introduction doesn't have a lot of pictures, but the rest of the book is profusely illustrated. But we need to understand something about why we're talking about Venice and and not just Venice, but also Pisa, also Genoa. These port cities of Italy are very important in history. They play a very important role because they actually link Europe up across the Mediterranean with the whole Mediterranean coast, the Eastern Mediterranean, Syria and so on, and North Africa, Egypt and so on. These port cities become like bridges across the Mediterranean. And you'll see how they perform that role. Okay, so let's read what Deborah Howard is saying. She says, founded in about 421 AD by refugees after the demise of the Roman Empire, it became the westernmost point of Eastern Christianity, of the Eastern Christendom, right? So the Roman Empire fell in the west, and it continued on as Byzantium in the east, right? So what you see is this idea of Europe we have now, it doesn't exist, okay? There's no such thing as Europe. There's the Huns and the Vandals and the Goths and all these groups that are known as the barbarian tribes. That is what Western Europe looks like for the most part. And then you have Spain and Portugal, Al-Andalus, the Islamic Spain and Portugal in the far west. But for most of the rest of Western Europe, there is no major civilization there. The major civilization is Byzantium in the east. And Venice it's the westernmost point of that Byzantine civilization, right? It's not part of Europe because there is no such thing as Europe. Europe is invented much later on, the idea of Europe. So this is the westernmost point of an Eastern civilization, which is Byzantium, right? And it looks east. Venice looks to the east. It's not looking back to the north or to the west. It's looking east. It's looking across the Mediterranean. And it begins to establish contacts with the Muslim world, all right? All these Islamic civilizations, although there's a whole lot of Christians and Jews also living there, nonetheless it's called, and pagans and, you know, all kinds of other sects. But it's generally referred to as the Muslim world, okay? And so Venice starts to establish links, right? Where was that map, right? It's over here to establish links with this world. After the Fourth Crusade, when the Catholics sacked Constantinople, Catholics on the west, then Venice was able to break free from because it was in theory ruled by Byzantium, and it starts to look for a new voice. It wants to, you know, asserting its independence, asserting its own identity. And you're going to see in this book how it tries to establish itself as an independent, flourishing, progressive, and important point in the world. And it looks for its inspiration from the Islamic world. one of its most important prototypes in formulating that confident individual cultural identity. And these things are going to become naturalized. It's not just copying, it's being inspired by something, and then it adapts it and it becomes naturalized. It becomes its own. It takes on a new form almost. And you must remember which cross-section of history we're cutting through, right? So we're cutting through a time in history where these Islamic civilizations are flourishing. They're in their golden ages. And Europe is really in the late Dark Age period at this point, right? So it's looking at this civilization that is far more prosperous than itself, far more, I mean, Europe is an illiterate continent at this point, you know, and it's looking at this civilization that has universities and stuff like this, you know, and it tries to emulate it. Eventually, it will come to see it as the inheritors of the Roman Empire, the inheritors of Byzantium. It sees it on that same level, and tries to emulate various aspects of it in asserting its own identity. So what is interesting is that it's not a subservient role, right? It's actually a trading partner, right? So Venice is not, the Western colonization happens afterwards, or actually during the later period, where during the later medieval ages, colonization begins. But this is just before that, or just at the beginnings of that, right? But there isn't a superior-inferior relationship, neither from the east to the west, nor from the west to the east. It's actually, there's an alliance of sorts, a partnership of sorts. And the primary partnership is trade, right? They have trading relationships, very intimate contacts with one another. Venice is trading with Damascus, with Cairo, and other kind of trading centers on the Eastern Mediterranean. So as I mentioned, Deborah Howard points out, at this time, there is no real concept of Europe, you know. There is no real concept of the Orient, right? These are things that get formed later when Europe starts to become more powerful in the early colonial period, in the 1500s and thereafter, where it has now, you know, it has conquered Spain and Portugal. This is after the Crusades, and it's starting to re-emerge as a power in the world. And it's starting to rule over foreign territories. And it is at this point that this idea of Europe starts to emerge, and the idea of the Orient starts to emerge. As Deborah Howard puts it up here, the idea of the Orient is an invention of the European mind. It depended on the idea of being Europe, right? So you don't get an Orient until you have a Europe, and Europe didn't exist before this. It is a product of a later imperialist mentality, right? As Europe is expanding imperially, it comes out of that period. So we're looking at a period just before that period, right? So all your perceptions in your mind about the East is the exotic, far distant, and Islam is the strange foreign thing, and the Europe is this Western thing, and those ideas all fall away because they are later inventions. So all the presumptions you have now, they don't apply at this point, not really. You have to actually look at things for what they are now before that time emerges. So Venice was interested in trading across the Mediterranean with the Eastern Mediterranean. It wasn't looking toward Europe, it was looking toward the south and the east over the Mediterranean. And then other parts of Europe would then trade with Venice and the other city-states, right? So here, Venice is trading with the Mediterranean world. And then the rest of Europe, the northerners, as Deborah Howard calls it, they come to Venice to trade with Venice, right? So this is how Venice becomes incredibly prosperous. Enormous amounts of wealth become concentrated there, because this whole world is arriving at this place, and then the mainland is trading with these places, and with Genoa and Pisa as well, right? So this is the world that Venice is speaking to. And the idea of Europe doesn't exist at this point. Okay. Venice's self-identity was actually very much all about not being part of the continental Europe because her prosperity laid elsewhere. The very townscape, in other words, the very city itself starts to be formed by those linkages. The culture starts to be formed, the architecture, the painting, the aesthetics, the mosaics, the artworks. All of that stuff is formed in the crucible of this relationship, right? So here she goes into the Islamic city as a typology, right? So that it's looking at this urban civilization and its culture and its institutions, and it is a city that's only coming into being, right? It's only starting to become more densely occupied, and so it is shaping itself around the interactions that it has. So here she's talking about how the city is organized, starts to become organized much like Islamic cities do. You know, this medieval labyrinth. It's not a Roman city, hey? How the Roman city is, you have the Cardo and the Decumanus, which is the cross-axis, you know, that runs north, south, and east, west, this cross-axis that is supposed to be a map of heaven according to the Romans, and all Roman cities are laid out like that. You'll see that's not what Venice looks like. It doesn't have a Roman foundation. It's not laid out according to its principles, you know. In the ancient parts of Roman city, you won't find a single dead end anywhere in the historic parts of ancient Rome. Yeah, dead ends are all over the place, right? So that your Western Roman civilization, the Roman Empire, that is not the model that is giving shape to the city. This shape has this city, it is a different interactions and different civilization and a different time that is giving shape to this, right? It is that world that is forming the city. And Deborah Howard is going to go into, you know, this is Cairo, you know, and she goes into how minarets like this, they start to appear in Venice. Domes like that start to appear in Venice. This kind of ornamentation on the parapets of roofs, they start to appear in Venice, right? But not in a way that it looks like it, but it's also different to it. Venice takes ownership of it, you know. It starts to imitate it, and then it becomes its own thing through this conversation that is happening with the East, the so-called East, the Eastern Mediterranean at least. So Deborah Howard's book goes into incredible amount of detail. You know, she analyzes mosaics in Damascus and the colors and the things that are being represented. And she shows how this migrates across the Mediterranean, that language. You know, this is the Great Mosque of Damascus. And she looks at how, you know, the size of the courtyard, the kinds of pillars, the arches, the way the smaller double arches sit on top of the big arch, you know, the big dome that sits on top of the pediment, and all of this stuff, the kinds of mosaics and so on and so forth, right? These make huge impressions on the Venetian merchants that are coming to these cities, and they live in these cities. Hey, it's not like you go once and you're back, but they actually have lodgings, they live here, they have close relationships with these spaces. This is a drawing of the San Marco and the piazza in front of it. And Deborah Howard shows us how that is actually in many ways modeled on that. It's about the same size, it's arcaded, and the mosaic, she goes into a lot of detail, how the mosaics on these things are actually speaking and in conversation with those things. Even things like how women dress, you know, Deborah Howard comments, the seclusion and veiling of women, often remarked on by visitors to Venice, suggests an affinity with Islamic society. Right? So some of you think, hey, these Muslim women that wear these scarves, and some of them wear veils in the more conservative parts in the Muslim world, that's like some foreign exotic thing. And no, Venetian women even dress like that, right? It was a sign of culture and nobility and sophistication and so on and so forth, right? Even on that level, all of these qualities contributed to the desired self-image of the Venetian Republic: civility, urbanity, culture, piety. You know, this was the self-identity of this new independent city that they were trying to cultivate. Okay, that's our introduction into Venice. So let's go into chapter 4. We're only going to read the introduction and this chapter. And she's talking about what happens. The city gets formed. The architecture is formed in these trade and economic relationships, but also the economic system, the very idea of economics and how you conduct trade relations and the kind of institutions. And it sounds very sort of specialized, but you'll see what I mean. How much architecture and landscape and city making is actually very much part of that, even in where we are in South Africa. You know, there is a line we can trace that goes back to this period. So around 1000 AD, so it is Venice is maybe about 500 years old or so, 600 years old. It's just a small settlement on a lagoon, and many others were around there, and they've all faded away. It's from the 13th century onwards that the city becomes compact enough to look like a city, and starts to emulate the much more densely built up Islamic cities. And, you know, they start to reclaim land and build up stuff. And Deborah Howard looks at how the cities start to emulate one another, you know, lots and lots of similarities, and sort of buildings jutting out on the, you know, above. On the left is Venice, on the right is a street scene in Damascus. Here, Howard says, the familiarity of many Venetians with this kind of cityscape, they actually preferred this. It was the intimacy, social cohesiveness, mode of living. This actually became something that the city aspired to look like. Okay, so we're going to go to the Rialto market, right? Remember that the bridge that spans over one of the main waterways. That's the Rialto, and the whole market around that zone. So you have all these words that enter into the Venetian language, you know. So you have, you know, the customs hall is called a duana, however that is pronounced, but that comes from an Arabic word which means like a customs hall, right? So there are all these economic terms and economic institutions that enter Italy and by extension enter Europe, which shows that economic influence. So what she shows here is, so here's the Rialto market, right? And that's the bridge, right, if you recall, and that's the square. So this is actually starts to develop huge similarities between the markets of the Eastern Mediterranean cities, right? And this is sort of known as a souk, right? So this is like a linear market that one walks through the whole city. Often it spans huge portions of the city. And then off that, you have these institutions of various kinds. Maybe it is a bathhouse, or maybe it is a school, or maybe it is the place where merchants from foreign places stay, right? So off the main line of the market, you start to have these larger institutions that happen off it. And this is exactly the model, the prototype that starts to become the commercial core of Venice, right? This long linear market, and then also just across the road is the Fondaco, the place where the merchants, foreign merchants from other countries stay, right? Which is just here over the bridge, which is also picking up on this kind of logic, right? Well, this is showing the Fondaco here. I think it's this one here, right? Yeah, so you have the market, which is sort of modeled on the souk, and then the Fondaco as an institution that's hugging that zone. These are all kind of images of Fondacos that are still in existence. And she looks at, I mean, she goes into so much detail, how even the architecture of, you know, countertops and folding screens that become counters, and, you know, she goes into a heck of a lot of detail. So this is in Venice. That is picking up again on a language that is happening in the other Eastern Mediterranean cities. And here is, you know, she shows how, you know, even minarets, you know, so they were used to living in these Eastern Mediterranean cities. They're used to the sound of, you know, the call to prayer from minarets. But of course, you don't have a minaret and call to prayer in a Catholic city. So you have a clock tower, and on the clock tower there's a bell, and there are these Moorish figures, as they are called, that sound a bell. So instead of the call to prayer, you have a bell tolled by these two Muslim guys instead of a minaret. But it's this language of an iconic urban piece and the sound that echoes. So this institution is really important, the fondaco. The fondaco, or trading post, is the building type most consistently associated with Oriental influence. So it normally looks like this, right? This is how it usually looked in Cairo or Damascus or other trading cities. It was usually a courtyard, and then you had some either storage places or meeting places on the ground floor, and then the lodgings of the merchants above it. And sometimes it was specialized according to particular kinds of wares that were sold. In the Arabic-speaking cities, they're known as a funduk, right? In Arabic, it's a funduk, and then it migrates across the Mediterranean, and then in Venetian, it becomes a fondaco, right? But it's coming out of the same word. And in the Islamic world, sometimes they were large things, and sometimes they were smaller. And this model enters Europe, right? This is another example of one in Damascus. And they were important institutions. You know, this is Alexandria, another important center in Egypt. And some of these flat roof buildings are funduks or fondacos. So they were important icons in the city. Some served as bases for colonies of foreign merchants, and some for the storage of sale or particular commodities. And that's a really important point to make. And then they were locked up at night for the safety of the goods. But what's happening here? Let's go back to this image. So here's Alexandria, and it's got these fondacos or funduks. Now, there's something really important that's starting to happen here, right? So this is a period before European colonization, but Europeans, well, if we call them Europeans, they're Venetians, they're not Europeans, there's not really a Europe at this time. But Venetians and the Genoese and so on, they now have these funduks or fondacos, fondaci, and these are like little colonies actually, right? So there's a colony that happens during the later European colonial period, which is about conquest and domination and ruling over these foreign territories and the people who live there. But here you have an idea of colony that's very different, right? So here you have merchants that are coming here as partners, and they are given a little piece of territory that almost becomes their own jurisdiction. They have their own laws and rules and so on, and they're almost given self-governance over it to a certain extent, right? It's a kind of a colony, right? So the Venetians are traveling across the Mediterranean, and they actually have colonies, these zones of other cities that are actually almost like their little colonial territories, but it's on an equal partnership, right? It's not about dominance. This is a very different kind of colonial setup that actually the governments of these places are giving these merchants territories, and they have privileges, they have rights, and, you know, all kinds of stuff. It's a very different kind of idea of a colony, right? But it's very important. It's going to have lots of implications going into the future. And these are these are like now medieval institutions, and she kind of tracks down remnants of old fondacos. This is an old image or drawing from one in Venice. That's Alexandria, so it's fondacos. This one is also Alexandria. This one is in Venice. This one is also in Venice, right? From the 15th century. And here you can start to see that this kind of articulated parapet, right, which is coming out of Cairo and coming out of Damascus and so on. So what Deborah Howard shows is that initially it's taking lots of different pieces, right? So here it's taking a facade of the funduk, but the plan is very different. So that building is this building, right? So the facade looks like a funduk, right? Where the merchants stay, but the plan is actually based on a hypostyle hall of a mosque. So it's like mixing typologies. It's taking little bits from many different things and kind of making something of its own. Again, here's another image of Fondako, but the plan is very different to the typical courtyard stuff that you find in Alexandria and these other cities on the Eastern Mediterranean. And then she shows how later on the typology becomes consolidated and it starts to actually look much, much more like those other things, you know, this courtyard with a well or cistern. And she even looks at how the plan very closely starts to resemble even where the staircases are planted and so on. You know, because these are the places that Venetians are, it's not like they're copying a foreign culture altogether. They are living in Cairo. They are living in Damascus. They have these little colonies there that are these established places where they have privileges, you know, and protection and so on. And they could, you know, if those rights and privileges were violated, they actually had grounds for official complaints on a governmental level. So they are living in those places, and then they take those things across the ocean with them, right, back across the Mediterranean. And so Deborah Howard shows us how that architecture starts to take shape over time, you know, drawing from different things, different aesthetics. She shows us how, you know, even the cityscape, the idea of economic activity, the idea of institutions, the very urbanism of the thing. The point I'm trying to make here is not about and oh, look at this culture and that culture and this one is borrowing from that one. I'm trying to show you that that linear canon, that Fletcher canon, that Renaissance canon, it's not real. The moment you study something in detail, like this, like Deborah Howard does and George Saliba does and so on, the moment you get into the detail of it and actually investigate things, you see that that history is not real. You know, look at this conversation that's happening here. You know, this Fletcher cannot account for something like this. The Renaissance canon cannot account for something like this, right? It cannot even make space for it. It has to change the whole narrative in order to account for it. So this is what I mean. It's not about adding things on. It's not about tacking things on. It's not about including things that have been excluded. The issue is actually the very narrative itself, the very core of the story, the very trunk of the tree. You know, even at that most fundamental level is where things need to change. But the point I'm trying to make also is that if we took a cross section, all of what I'm talking about is this, right? This is a diagram of what we are talking about here, right? And we are taking a section, as I mentioned, we are taking a section through here, the late medieval and the early modern period, just before where we are now. We're just winding back a couple of centuries. And that is what our cross section looks like. But I'm saying to you, I'm not suggesting that we must draw that line, that Islamic civilization is now a line that, no, it doesn't do that. It also comes up from, you know, I mean, gosh, the Arabs were like the people, the Persian emperors used to call them lizard eaters and things like this. They were a culture that had no civilization. Right, initially, if you go back just a little bit, right? But I'm saying to you, this is where we're taking a cross section. But if we cut it through anywhere else, many other civilizations are going to come up to the fore, and many other civilizations are going to fall down. That's what I'm trying to say. It rises and falls, but it's also intersecting with one another. There are places where these things cross over, right? And so that story is not a real story, right? That story is not a real story. Right? When you see that, and I hope, you know, you can start to recognize these narratives when you see them, these discourses when you see them, right? Because they are tools, they are identities that are being mobilized. There are instruments of power that are being mobilized, right? There's a lot of power going on here. Who gets to say, right? Who gets to write a history like this? This is an incredible thing to say. And there are many scholars now. A huge body of scholarship is growing that is trying to do that. And Deborah Howard is one of those people, and Saliber and Belting and all of them are trying to do that work, right? And it's difficult work to actually do that. Let me quickly move on to our last reading. Benedict Kohler, he's a German banker, economist, economic historian. He writes this book called Early Islam and the Birth of Capitalism. What he's doing, he's actually very directly building on the scholarship of people like Howard and others, right? But he's focusing on the economic dimension, very specifically, economic institutions, economic transactions, economic ideas, right? Because we as architects are looking at space and form and townscape and urbanism and so on, and aesthetics and materials and patterns and things like that. He acknowledges that. He's aware of all of that and all of that scholarship that is happening. But he's saying, I'm an economist. And things were not only happening on a visual, formal language. It's not just the shape of an arch, or it's actually the very idea of how economics works, how economics are organized, right? So he adds his lens to this other kind of scholarship that is happening in the sciences, in architecture and painting and all of that. He brings his own perspective. So this is just one part of that world, right? That all those historical patterns in our cross-section that we are trying to figure out. He just brings one aspect, right? It's not a separate thing. He very much understands it as speaking to that other kind of scholarship that's happening, right? So Benedict Kohler's book is published in 2014. We're not going to read too much of it, and it's going to be a really zip through here. Hey? So he's an economist, and he's interested in how economic ideas are taking shape. So he looks at, because Europe is the dominant canon, so you always have to enter into conversation with Europe. Not because you're obsessed with Europe, but because it forces you to, right? If it's the dominant canon, if it dictates all the terms of the conversation, you have to enter into a conversation with it. So he says, okay, so let's look at Europe. Where is the biggest economic contribution that happens? And he traces it in Europe back to Herodotus, who's an ancient Greek historian. So Herodotus puts forward some ideas about economics. And so Benedict Kohler says, but ever since Herodotus, there's nothing that comes out of Western Europe. So he says ancient Greece and Rome bequeathed no economic literature of any consequence, right? And since the ancient Greeks, there was nothing that came out of Europe in terms of economics, right? So yes, Rome is a huge, powerful civilization with all kinds of accomplishments. They built a road network across the whole Mediterranean, so many things. Kohler is saying in terms of an economic contribution and economic literature, almost nothing happens after Herodotus for almost 2,500 years. But there is a heck of a lot of innovation that is happening in the medieval, late medieval period. So Benedict Kohler is asking the question, where did it come from, right? Because it's not coming out of this stuff. It's not coming out of antiquity, definitely not. So he's asking the question, where does it come from? And then he looks at the main theories, which I don't have time to go into. But then the core question he asks is here. He says, Werner Sambat, another economic historian, points out, and others also point out, Adam Smith and various big economists in the early 20th century and earlier, they point out that Europe's economic growth trends begin specifically in the medieval Italian mercantile republics, such as Venice and Genoa, right? So this new prosperity happens in precisely the cities in the late medieval period that are trading with the Eastern Mediterranean. It is in these cities that we see the beginnings of capitalism. It is in these cities that we see the beginnings of a prosperous Europe. right? Real wealth being accrued and so on from those trading relationships. And so the core question that Benedict Kohler asks in this book is, if it did not come from these relationships, then where did it come from? Because it didn't come from ancient Rome. And if it did not come from these relationships between Venice, Pisa, Genoa, with Damascus, Cairo, Alexandria, if it did not come from that, then why is it that the formative period of capitalism and its institutions emerge in precisely these places, these ports that are trading with the Eastern Mediterranean Islamic civilizations? You know, why does it emerge there and nowhere else? Why is it in these port cities and nowhere else that we see it? It's a very important question that he asks. It's an historical question, right? If it, you know, if it could have come from, if it came from another source, but why does it appear only in these places and only in those places that have these deep trading relationships? That is where we see the beginnings of institutions we recognize as capitalist. That's like one of the core questions. And he goes into a lot of, you know, again, a lot of terminology, traffic, check, carrot, you know, all these economic terms. You know, traffic is an Arabic word. It's one of these various used in economic terms. Trade between Muslims and Christians became a conduit for importing into Europe new approaches to commercial institutions and frameworks. Capitalism in Europe, through this process, came into being, right? This is the core argument of Benedict Kohler. It is in this conversation that these early capitalist institutions and frameworks start to take root in Europe. Pisa, Genoa, Venice, they were all in competition with one another for those Mediterranean trading networks. And they even fought with one another in certain ways. And he mentions many things, but architecturally, the funduk is a key sort of clear architectural typology. But what Deborah Howard points out, how it's an architectural typology, but Benedict Kohler shows how it's an idea about doing economics, an idea of that you can establish trading posts in territories of foreign countries and have a prosperous economic relationship there with a particular kind of colonial setup. He points to how this becomes absorbed into Europe. So this is his introduction, and then we jump way over to chapter 16. And he's speaking here about funduks. They were kind of gateways, one territory into another, one continent into another. He looks at where it becomes a building typology, not just an open market, and so it can function all year round. They were jointly sponsored by Muslim and Christian sponsorship. They had a relationship with local councils. A consul was nominated, etc. It was a whole formal arrangement. It wasn't an informal system. To a certain extent, it was governmental, but it was, you know, very formal official relationships. Okay, and then we jump to the conclusion. Again, they're pointing out this coincidence that is not really a coincidence about how it is in Italian port cities that these institutions like, you know, venture capitalism, offshore trading, I mean, I don't want to go into a lot of technical terms, but Benedict goes into all kinds of terms and shows how these economic frameworks, not just an architectural typology, but there's an economic framework that underlays the architectural typology that is setting in place the dynamics of capitalism. This orderly commerce bestowed riches on merchants in ports on Italy's coast, and the ascent of inland republics such as Milan and Florence followed from the prosperity rippling outwards, right? So he's saying that these incredibly prosperous cities, I mean, look how prosperous they were. Genoa in the 12th century generated more tax revenue than France. One city becomes more prosperous in terms of tax revenue than an entire country. That's how rich these cities became. Palermo, another city, this one is in Sicily, more tax revenue than the whole of England, Italian republics were accumulating wealth at a faster rate than entire empires or kingdoms. And the riches of Italian patricians could begin to stand comparison with European royalty, right? So the elite of the merchants, they're like on the level of European royalty, So you can imagine how wealthy they are becoming. Italy's mercantile republics were incubators for institutions that helped capitalism flourish, such as venture capitalism means when you finance companies that are going to go on foreign trading excursions, and I'm not going to go into all of that. So here, Benedict Kohler is describing how it is from the coast, from the ports, that prosperity ripples into the interior. And he's telling us that it is not from Florence that wealth is accrued and then it ripples outwards. It's actually from the port cities and it ripples inward, right? It's a completely different narrative. It's not even accounted for in the canon. And here, Kohler ends off with Spain and Portugal and other European empires that are emerging in the Renaissance period, and going across the Atlantic to the New World, the Americas, and going around the African coast. These economic frameworks and institutions travel with them, and they take on new forms, right? They go to the Americas, and they go to the East Indies, and they come, yes, believe it or not, they come to South Africa. These institutions and these frameworks, they arrive on the shores of South Africa, and they shape the South African landscape. And it becomes part of the modernity of South Africa. But quickly, just to recap again, we're responding to this stuff, and we're trying to make histories that look more like this stuff. Because there are principles and values and ideas and biases and prejudices and all kinds of stuff, There's more than a little bit of racism also going on there. And this is the kind of histories that many scholars are participating in, and we are also participating in that conversation.
Una mattina mi sono alzato, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Una mattina mi sono alzato e io ho trovato l'invasor. Oh partigiano, portami via, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Oh partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morire. Oh partigiano.